Oh man, guys, what's that dark cloud I see out there on the horizon? Is it a dust storm? Because it seems like dust is the only thing anybody wants to talk about in Cardano right now. If you generally find yourself trying to avoid dust storms and dust in all of its other forms, or if you're finding value in these videos, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. All right, guys, we are now living in a post midnight world. Okay, maybe not post midnight, but we had a pretty big unveiling of some things about midnight at the Cardano Summit 2023. We definitely don't know all the details yet. I think there's a lot of details still to come, tokenomics and all those kinds of things. But I've noticed a few different themes popping up over and over again. People have been asking me about dust over and over again. And I've also seen the theme that you can see here in this thread from Gamia Haskell. Basically, the question being asked here, and I think it is the right question. I'm glad people are asking this question. That question is midnight really going to be good for Cardano? Because it definitely has a bunch of sort of independent elements to it. There are a lot of things about midnight that make it look a lot more like a standalone blockchain. It's a side chain. It's not an L2. It's not a layer 2 of Cardano. It's a side chain. It has a lot of things in common with a completely independent blockchain, but it's not completely independent. It's a side chain. So people are rightfully asking the question, is this actually going to accrue any advantages to Cardano itself, to ADA holders itself? That's the question being asked in this thread. And not surprisingly, in Cardano, this isn't a surprise. In a lot of other ecosystems, this would probably be a big surprise. But in Cardano, not really a surprise. Charles was more than happy to weigh in and give his perspective on this issue. Charles is going to lay out his response in a couple of different posts as he sort of gets peppered with questions here. This is the first one. From the very beginning of Cardano, we mentioned the concept of control or computation layers. These are the CCLs we talked about yesterday and we talked about a long time ago on this channel. These CCLs that follow different or augmented transaction, network, and consensus logic. And this is that same strain of thought that we might end up with, a layer verse of these kinds of CCLs where we make different and arbitrary compromises on the blockchain trilemma in each one of those layers. Then he gets into something different. You cannot overload the mainnet with these divergent features. It's both unwise and in some cases technically impossible. The point of Midnight is to add to the Cardano ecosystem a completely new way of handling regulated value transfer, data confidentiality, and snark-based applications. These are complementary capabilities to Cardano. They aren't intended to replace Cardano, nor can. So a couple of different things here. So he's saying, hey, it's not a good idea to bloat the base layer with all of these different functions and features. And it's also technically impossible, right? The base layer token can't simultaneously be a privacy coin and be not. So you can't have a base layer coin like ADA and have it simultaneously be a privacy coin and not a privacy coin. I'm sure there's some blockchain out there that's tried to do something that they labeled in that same way, but you can't really imagine a future where your ADA is a privacy coin and simultaneously is not. You'd have to have some kind of like flipping function where you sort of flip into the privacy side of the blockchain and you flip out. It's much easier to compartmentalize things. And this brings up another consideration. And here, these are not thoughts expressed in Charles' post here. We're just going to talk about something that comes to mind. We don't know what regulators are going to do with privacy coins in the future. We do know what they've done in the past. They've jumped all over them and tried to stamp them out of existence, stomp them out of existence, really. We're calling this a data confidentiality network, but there are probably regulators who are going to look at this and say, I know what that is. That's a privacy coin, and we don't like them. And some regulator could wake up a year from now and say, you know what? I've always hated crypto. And right now, what I'm going to hate the most are privacy coins. And I don't care if you call it a data confidentiality token, a data confidentiality network. I just hate them. We hate crypto generally. And what we hate the most are privacy coins, because then we can really get a lot of mileage out of our whole, all the criminal bad guys in the world use crypto. Therefore, crypto is bad kind of line of thinking. So, it's good to compartmentalize that. If you're going to have something that's vulnerable to that kind of criticism and possibly even regulation, you want to compartmentalize it in a separate chain, separate from Cardano, because it's hard to predict what the regulators are going to do. Not a lot of people were saying, hey, look out, Operation Choke Point 2.0 is going to happen. Sure, we talked about it on this channel, and a lot of other people, a lot of other commentators were, predicting that regulation could happen. But nobody was thinking, not, or I should say, not a lot of people were thinking, hey, Operation Choke Point 2.0 is going to happen, starting on this date, and it's going to last for basically a couple of years. That did happen. Regulators are unpredictable. We don't know who's going to be in the White House, you know, over the course of the next several years. That might determine, the part of the probability of how different things in crypto are going to be handled. We don't even know who's going to be in the White House, let alone what the regulators they appoint are going to do with crypto. So we can guess roughly who might be better or worse for crypto, but we don't really know what's going to happen. So it's good to compartmentalize all of this data confidentiality stuff in Midnight. It's also good not to overly bloat the base layer blockchain. It's also technically impossible to simultaneously have ADA be ADA and also have ADA and the Cardinal base layer doing what it looks like IOG wants Midnight to do. Charles is going to get a little more specific here as he gets peppered with questions like how exactly is Midnight going to leverage Cardano? He says, ideally, you have a dual token model. We talked about this yesterday, with one living unshielded on Cardano as a native asset that follows a deflationary monetary policy. So, two tokens, a dual token system. One of them is going to look a lot like the crypto assets you're used to. It's going to be a Cardano native asset. It's going to follow a deflationary monetary policy like Bitcoin, where everybody knows there will only ever be 21 million of them. And a lot of people buy that token hoping to get rich. That's a big part of crypto, for better or worse. The other token is going to be a token aimed more at the types of businesses that we're hoping are actually going to use this sidechain. Because after all, this sidechain is providing a service to enterprise who want their operational business costs to be predictable. They don't, like we talked about yesterday, they don't want to wake up one morning and find out that it's now going to cost them 5 times as much to use this service that this sidechain is offering. So we need that token to be predictable. But predictable pricing is not the kind of stuff that liquidity accumulation is made of. In crypto, one of the things we know is that for sure, no one would have poured as much money into crypto if there was no chance of the price of the assets going up. If the assets were designed not to go up, to have predictable pricing, then people wouldn't pour as much money into it. Here, we're kind of talking about getting the best of both worlds. We're talking about having one of those traditional crypto assets on the base layer that does all the normal crypto stuff, and then also having this other asset on the actual side chain that serves as fuel. In Ethereum, they call it gas, but fuel for the side chain. It's the asset that the transaction fees are paid in, not getting into the complications of Babel fees that we'll talk about in just a second. So we've got these two different assets. Charles says, this separates ownership of the network resources and maintenance of the ledger from the pricing of the service that the partner chain offers. Dual tokens are the future for anything that wants to offer a decentralized service with predictable prices. And of course, Charles is going to get some additional questions here That doesn't answer the question. And so Charles goes into more detail on why you don't really care about the assets being different. He says, with Babel fees, you don't care. Native asset transactions will settle in their underlying currency, but actually use ADA under the hood. So that's been the premise of Babel fees all along. We've talked about this many times on the channel, but for those of you who haven't seen those videos, this is all sort of based on the Tower of Babel paradigm. Instead of, in this case, instead of the people all speaking many different languages and not being able to communicate with each other, we're talking about many different Cardano native assets, of which we have a large variety on Cardano already. Babel fees allows for people to be transacting in all of those various different Cardano native assets, and for the transaction fees under the hood still to be operating in ADA. So he says, and people will spend ADA to use Midnight, and it settles in dust. So again, Midnight is the name of the network. ADA and dust would be assets. So he's saying people will spend ADA. They're going to want to use Midnight. And to use Midnight, they're going to spend ADA. And everything's going to settle in dust under the hood. So underneath it all, in Midnight, the settlement of all the transactions is going to be happening in dust. Charles says that's the point of a dual token service model with Babel fees. It drives demand for ADA, but allows for predictable pricing. So I think a lot of this isn't going to be clear until we have more pappers. Cardano, obviously famous for having so many pappers. I think what we need at this point is a little more papperage. We need a little more papperage. I think we need to see some nice white papers sort of laying out exactly how the tokenomics on this are all going to work. Some nice infographics, some nice flowcharts showing us exactly how everything's going to settle between dust and ADA and Midnight and bridges to other chains. We need a little papperage here, and I think things are probably not going to be clear until we have those kinds of white papers laying out all those things in like very clear terms. I'm not sure. We've already got the DevNet. The DevNet is starting very soon. When are they going to start onboarding different teams to Midnight? Is it November 11th? Something like that. Something very soon. So I think what we need at this point is a little bit more information about how all of this is going to work. If they're already ready to start onboarding dev teams, then I think it's time. And they've already pretty much unveiled Midnight, but I think it's time to push those white papers out to the public so we can all see what's going on here. But until that happens, I think it might be a little premature for people to be asking so many questions about the dust airdrop and when they're going to be able to get their hands on these different assets, because there's going to be one of the assets that's going to be involved with Midnight is meant to have predictable pricing. So I think a lot of people are missing that one of these assets is not going to be the kind of traditional crypto asset that they're probably thinking of, the kind of thing they buy and then they can, sit around and have the wild daydreams of, Cardano moon Lambos and all those kinds of things. So we don't have all the details yet on the different assets that are going to be involved in Midnight. We don't know about tokenomics. It's not exactly clear how everything's going to settle and exactly how this is going to drive demand for ADA. It's already a little controversial. People are already kind of, arguing amongst themselves about whether this is going to be net positive for ADA or not. But I think this is kind of an inevitable move. I've always thought that the layerverse was inevitable, not just in Cardano, but probably for every ecosystem. Because what we figured out is that no one has figured out how to do it all on one chain. This certainly has not been the case in Ethereum. In Bitcoin, they basically just don't do anything but the most basic stuff. So they can do that. You can do that on one chain. If you just do what Bitcoin does, you can do that on one chain. But the second you start talking about a Gen 3 blockchain, and here we've got Midnight, which adds new capabilities to make it a Gen 4 blockchain, No one's figured out how to do all that on one chain because we have different use cases, we have different functions, different needs in crypto. And I think we're going to need different layers in every blockchain ecosystem. And we can argue, there's different arguments we can have about interoperability and avoiding DeFi contagion, and a lot of these things we've talked about quite a bit on this channel. That certainly served us well during the FTX days. Not being connected to FTX was certainly a boon for us here in Cardano. So we can argue about interoperability, but I think the layerverse thing, it's pretty clear. Nobody's figured out how to do it all on one chain, how to create the Swiss Army base layer where you never need any other layers. I think it's becoming more and more clear that we do need these other layers, and it's looking like we've got other side chains in Cardano, at least one other very notable big one, but Midnight's going to be the first really big partner chain of this type to use this new nomenclature. And it's going to do some very interesting things in terms of some of the privacy functions and incorporating Babel fees, and possibly including different resources for consensus in Minotaur. This is going to be very interesting, but I think people are jumping the gun a little bit. I hope your week is starting out great, that everything else in your life is going wonderfully, and I will talk to you soon.